Maseches Yevamos Daf Ayin Aleph discusses three sugyas, all on the topic of an orel, somebody who doesn't have a bris milah. The Gemara is first going to be analyzing the opinion of Rabbi Akiva as to what is the source that an orel does not eat truma. Then the Gemara will have two questions as to the halachas of an orel. The Gemara will discuss, is an orel who's not chayiv in a bris milah because he's less than 8 days old, does that preclude him from being able to eat truma or a carbon pesach? Meaning, does an orel who has no chiyuv arla count as an orel or not as far as hachas orel? And the third question will be, does hazah, sprinkling of paraduma water, work on an orel or not? So let's begin. The Gemara has had a discussion earlier as to what is the source that an orel does not have permission to eat from truma, even if he otherwise would be able to. We had seen the opinion of Rabbi Lazar and the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Lazar had said that it's learned out of a connection of carbon Pesach through the words Toshav V'Sacher, which are extra in carbon Pesach. And Rabbi Akiva had said it's learned out of the fact that when it's listing those who cannot eat truma, it says ish ish, extra phrase ish. So the Gemara now analyzes the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, and the discussion is very much along the same lines as we had for Rabbi Elazar. Then the Gemara will explain what each one does with the other one's drasha. So the Gemara asks, according to Rabbi Akiva, it says ish ish. How do you know that the extra ish is to include on the list of people who cannot eat truma in orel? Maybe it's to include an onain. We know that the halacha is that an onain, that somebody who lost a close relative and he's yet to be buried, is allowed to eat truma. Maybe he should be excluded from eating truma by the phrase ish ish. Maybe he should be added to the list by the phrase ish ish. So the Gemara says no. We already know that an onain is explicitly allowed to eat truma because it says v'chol zar. Only a zar is excluded from eating truma, but onain is allowed to eat truma. So the Gemara says, but maybe that was what it says v'chol zar. You don't know it's excluding. It's adding something. Someone's allowed to eat truma. You don't know that that's talking about an onain. Maybe that's talking about an orel. The Gemara says no, an orel is excluded from ish ish. The Gemara says again, you have something included from v'chol zar. You have something excluded from ish ish. How do you know which one? How do you know that you should say an orel doesn't eat truma and an onain does? Maybe it's the other way around. The Gemara says, well, like we said earlier, there's 5 different ways in which the issue of being an orel, having an orla, not having a bris milah is more severe than being an onain, and therefore if we're going to exclude somebody from truma, it's going to be him. The Gemara gives a simon for what those 5 things are: maisim, krusim, bedavar, ha'avad, and they are as follows. First of all, an orel is mechusar ma'is, is missing an actual action, and onain there's nothing he's supposed to be doing. Secondly, action of an orel is in his body himself needs to be fixed. Third, his issue that of not having a bris milah is something which carries the penalty of kares, even if he's not over anything, but it's still an issue which carries kares for somebody who is over. Fourth, mitzvah milah was given before Matan Torah. And fifth, the milah is a psol, even if just his avadim and his sons didn't do a milah, that passes him from eating truma. There's no issue of aninus for one's avadim and sons. Says the Gemara, what do you mean? Aninus has its own 3 ways in which it is more chomer. First of all, it applies all the time. It can apply many times. A person can only have a bris milah once, but he can have aninus many times. It applies to both men and to women as opposed to bris milah, and there's nothing you can do to fix it as opposed to bris milah that you can change the situation. So the Gemara says, okay, that's very nice that aninus has 3 ways in which it's more chomer. However, the orel has 5 ways. 5 is more than 3. Rava gives another reason. Rava says there's a reason to specifically assume that ish ish is applying to an orel because it uses the word ish, which means a man, and orel applies only to men, as opposed to onions, which applies both to men and to women. Shouldn't use the phrase ish ish for that. Okay, that's how the Gemara concludes as far as Rabbi Akiva goes. Now the Gemara says, what is Rabbi Akiva going to do with the phrase Toshav Sacher? We learned from Toshav Sacher, where it says Toshav Sacher in a carbon Pesach, that's to show the link between carbon Pesach and Truma, and just like an orel cannot eat carbon Pesach and cannot eat Truma, according to Rabbi Akiva, you don't need that. So what is the phrase Toshav Sacher for? Now Toshav Sacher we also assumed was referring to an Eved Ivri. However, it cannot be possibly meaning an Eved Ivri, according to Rabbi Akiva, because an Eved Ivri is allowed to eat from the carbon Pesach. Why would it say that Toshav Sacher cannot eat from the carbon Pesach? So who was Toshav Sacher saying the word Toshav and the word Sacher? Who is it referring to that cannot eat from a carbon Pesach? And it cannot be referring to any kind of orel, because we already know that an orel can't eat from a carbon Pesach, according to Rabbi Akiva. So the Gemara says it refers to a guy who's not mahol, who is mahol, a guy who's not an orel. So it refers to an Arab that has a Muslim bris milah, or for say Givoni. There was a nation called Givonim. They had bris milah as well. They are excluded by the phrase toshav v'sachir. They're not a toshav and sachir. Even though they're not a relim, they're excluded by that. Someone says, no, that can't be, because the general term oral is used to refer to any type of akum, any type of a guy. It even refers to a guy who has a bris milah, and it does not refer to Yisrael, even if the Yisrael is an oral. When we say oral, we generally mean a guy. When we say non-oral, when we say mahol, we generally mean a Yisrael. The Gemara shows that by quoting a Mishnah that says that somebody who says, I'm not having any hana from an oral, that is, he's not allowed to have enough from a guy even if he's mal. He is allowed to have enough from Yisrael even if he's an oral. Same thing applies the other way. If he says, I'm not having enough from a mahol, he's not allowed to have enough from Yisrael even if he's an oral, and he is allowed to have enough from a guy even if he's a mahol. So you see, therefore, the term oral just refers to a guy. So you cannot say that we needed an extra phrase. If we already excluded oral, you need an extra phrase for a guy who has a milah. That can't be. He's included in the category of oral. So the Gemara says it's referring to something else. It's referring to a Yisrael who is not a full-fledged Yisrael. That is, it's referring to a Yisrael who's not an oral, but he has a bris milah. What's that? So that could be either a convert who didn't do a milah yet, somebody who has toval. That is the opposite. It's referring to a convert who did tevilah but not milah. So he's converted, but he's not a full convert because he didn't do a milah yet. It's referring to a ger who did a milah and not a tefillah. That is, he converted, and therefore he did a milah. He cannot be considered to be a akum because he was mol, but he's still not a full-fledged convert because he's mol v'loitavel. He didn't do tefillah yet. Also, it's referring to a katan that was noilad mahol, that he never had a bris milah, but you still can't call him an oral because he's noilad mol. Someone like that, those two are excluded by toshav v'sachir. They don't have a full count. They're not fully considered to be a toshav and they're excluded by the phrase toshav v'sachir. So the Gemara says that we're saying this in the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva therefore has to hold that those two don't count. That means he has to hold that a ger shemo v'lo toval did milah and not tefillah doesn't count as a ger, and therefore he cannot eat from a carbon pesach. And a katan's noilad mol is not allowed to stay that way. He has to do some type of bris. He has to do a tafas non bris. He has to draw blood. Now, Rabbi Eliezer doesn't have any of these two limudim. He holds toshav and sachar is referring to in Eved Ivri, like we said earlier in the last daf. Therefore, he will hold that both these two halachos are not true. He'll hold that a ger that did milah and not tefillah does count as a ger, and he's allowed to eat carbon pesach. And he will hold that a katan who's born with a bris milah, who's born mahol, does not have to do anything. He doesn't have to do a tafas dan bris, and therefore he's allowed to eat carbon pesach. The other thing that's left to discuss is Rabbi Eliezer. What does he do with the phrase ish ish? According to him, he doesn't need that. What's that for? So the Gemara just says that's how people talk. That's a general expression. It's a colloquial expression. Ish ish. You don't need anything for that. Okay, that wraps up the Gemara's discussion of the source that an oral cannot eat truma. Now the Gemara says, what about an oral who is not chayiv in milah yet? He can't possibly do a milah yet. That the only situation in which that is if he's less than 8 days old. So the Gemara says, is he allowed to eat truma? Now, the Gemara is working with the understanding throughout the coming sugya that a child, an infant, eats nothing other than his mother's milk, and therefore there's no question of him eating truma. There is no truma milk. What there is, though, is truma oil, which can be rubbed into the skin, and rubbing something into the skin counts as eating, the Gemara says, working with the concept of sicha kishtiya, counts as eating. So the Gemara therefore asks, what is the psul of arla? Is it if you have an oral, you have an arla, but it cannot be removed, it's shloi bizmana, it's not as manchiv yet, does that count as an arla or not? Is it only become an arla when he turns 8 days old, or does it count as an arla from when he's born? It just doesn't have to be removed yet, but he still has the status of an arla. So the Gemara says we'll bring a proof. The proof is going to be from a brisa that discusses the halacha that a person is not allowed to eat from a carbon pesach or eat truma, as long as specifically said this halacha is by carbon pesach, that if his avadim or his zecharim, that is his sons or his avadim, do not have a bris milah. Now, there are two stages in the Korban Pesach. There's the Shechita of the Korban Pesach and the eating of the Korban Pesach. And referring to Avadim and referring to Scharim, the Torah specifically mentions only one of the stages for each. So the Psukim say, V'chi yagar idcha ger v'asa Pesach Hashem, he moloi kol zachar, oz yikrav la'asaysay. Before you could do the Shechita, before you can shech the Korban Pesach, you have to make sure that every son and every zachar, every son in the family has a milah already. That means that the son, you cannot shech the Korban Pesach if you have a son with a milah. Now, as far as avadim, it says you have to make sure your eved has a bris milah before you can eat it. So it says that you cannot do shechita unless your son has a milah. You cannot do achila. You cannot eat from the Korban Pesach unless you make sure all your avadim has a milah. This is how do you know that the opposite applies as well? How do you know you can't shech if you have avadim who need a milah, and you cannot eat if you have sons who need a milah? So the Gemara says that's from the drasha uz. Both of them have the word uz involved, and therefore it says uz yochalbo. And therefore you know that both halachas apply to both of them. Says the Gemara, what is the case that this works out? So I understand that it could possibly be a case where you had an eved that b'shas asiyah, when he did the shechita, wasn't a problem. But you have a problem now when you're trying to eat the Korban Pesach, you have an eved without a milah. How is that possible? How is that possible? Because if we're going to give a limud that the eved blocks you from eating the Korban Pesach because he didn't have a bris milah, that means somehow you shechted it and it was no problem. How did you shech the Korban Pesach if you have an eved that didn't have a bris milah? Says no problem. At the time of shechita, you did not own this eved. You purchased the eved after the shechita. Now you want to eat the Korban Pesach. The Torah has to tell you, you can't until you do a bris milah on that eved. So that's a possibility. However, how do you have the opposite case? How do you have a situation in which you have a son who did not block you from eating the Korban Pesach? He did not block you from shechting the Korban Pesach, that is. There was no problem with the fact that he didn't have bris milah then. But now, you want to come eat, now you can't eat until you do a bris milah on him. How is that possible? It couldn't be that the son was born, because the Korban Pesach has to be shechted on Erev Pesach before Chatzos, and has to be eaten on Erev Pesach after Chatzos. So he could not possibly be born during that time. You would not be chayv in a bris milah yet. What must have happened? The only way to resolve this, the Gemara says, has to be that from the moment he's born, he's already considered to be an oral. He's already chayiv in the mitzvah of milah, and he already blocks his father from being able to eat the Korban Pesach. Therefore, it makes sense to say that he was born between the shechita and the achila. If he was born between the shechita and the achila, and it's true that from the moment he's born, he already blocks the achila, now I know that it makes sense in the cases where he was born between the shechita and the achila. If it's until he turns 8 days old, he can't turn 8 days old between the shechita and the achila, because he turns 8 days old at the beginning of the day. It goes by the day. He's chayv in a bris milah from the 8th day in the morning. So it couldn't. That you wouldn't have that happen between shechita, which happens before chatzos on erev Pesach, and achila, which happens after chatzos on erev Pesach. So it says the Gemara, no, it's not a problem. Maybe I'll tell you a situation in which it could be that his Chiyav Milah began between Chatzos and after Chatzos. It began after Shechita and before Achila. And the Gemara is going to give a number of examples in which this could work out. Some will require some discussion. So the Gemara first wants to say that there was a problem. The Gemara first says that what has to be is that he was sick. He was ill, he was yellow, let's say, and he couldn't do a bris milah, and he got healed on that time. He recovered and he was cured, so he was patur from a bris milah at the time of shechita, and he was chayv from a bris milah at the time of achila because he recovered. Says Gemara, but somebody who was so sick, you have to wait 7 days until he recovers. You wait 7 days, and you only do the bris milah on the 8th day, because you consider him to be the day that he recovers is considered to be the day that he's born, and you wait till 8 days later. So it couldn't be that he recovered that day. It has to be that he recovered 7 days earlier. Well, if that's so we have back to the original problem, that you go by recovery from the beginning of the day. So the beginning of the day would be before Shechita. It wouldn't be between Shechita and Mila. So the Gemara says no, because as far as recovery goes, we go me'es la'es. We go to the time of the day in which he recovered. That's when he's chayiv in that Mila. So he recovered 8 days earlier on between, let's say at Chatzais, between the time of Shechita and the time of Achila, of the Korban Pesach. Says the Gemara, is that halacha true? We have a statement from a Chacham called Luda, who says that the day he recovers counts as the day he's born. Or says, yeah, it counts as the day he's born in the sense that you have to wait till 8 days later, but it's better than the day he's born because here you also have to wait till the time he recovered, not to the morning of the 8th day from which he recovered. Now, the Gemara gives more answers, more situations in which you could have a child become chayav in a bris milah between the time of Shechita and the time of Achila. Next answer is from Rav Papa. He says that he didn't have a severe illness. He just had, his eye was hurting, some limb was hurting specifically. That you don't have to wait 7 days, you don't have to wait 8 days. He recovered from that between the time of Shechita and the time of Achila, and you were chayav in the bris milah then. Rava says his parents were locked in prison, and therefore his parents were patur from doing the bris milah. Nobody was chayiv on the bris milah. There is no chiyuv on anybody else. It's just on the parents, and they were freed between the time of Shechita and the time of Achila. Rav Kahana, son of Rav Nachman, says another answer. He was a tumtum, that is that he had a layer of flesh over his makam amila, and he couldn't get a bris milah, but it was torn open and it was revealed to be a zachar at that time. Therefore, it became chayiv in a bris milah at that exact moment. Now, Rav Shiravia gives an interesting answer, which is where we'll discuss. He says that the child stuck his head out of the womb, that is, he was partially born, his head was out, and therefore was considered to be born, and he stayed in that position for 7 days, and he came all the way out at the time between Shechita and Achila, and therefore he was chayiv in the bris only when he came fully out. It wasn't chayiv in the bris until he was fully out, but he was considered to be born already, so he started counting the 8 days from the moment he stuck his head out. Says the Gemara, is it possible for a child to be in that position for an entire week? We know that once that happens, he's no longer fed through his umbilical cord. Once his head is out, that is at the time which the umbilical cord stops feeding him and he starts having to be fed through the mouth. But if he's stuck in the birth canal, he can't be fed. His mother can't possibly nurse him. So what then did he eat? He had no way that he could survive. So says the Gemara, well, it could be that he had a fever. And the Metzias is that when a child has a fever, it could survive for 7 days without eating. The Rishonim explain how that works. So the Gemara says he had a fever. Who had a fever? If he had the fever, then he had a severe fever. Then you have to wait 7 days until the fever subsides, until you can do the bris milah. So it has to be that his mother had the fever, and his mother's fever warmed him up also, and that was able to keep him fed for that entire time. Another answer is that he was screaming while he was in that position. The screaming also feeds him, also keeps him sustained during that entire time. Now, that concludes that discussion. Now the Gemara moves on to another sugya, and that is, can you do hazah? Can you sprinkle paraduma water on an aral? Somebody who has a bris milah. So if somebody is tamei mace and he wants to get paraduma procedure, which takes 7 days, requires hazah on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. So whenever you start, there's going to be 4 days apart they'll be sprinkling. Can that apply to somebody who didn't have a bris milah yet? And then you'll do the bris milah afterwards, after the hazah, and then you can eat from the Pesach. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yechon says in the name of Rabbi Bana, yes, sprinkling works, paraduma water works, even on an aral. And we find that this can be proven from Aveseinu. He says in the Midbar, when Klal Yisrael left, the Midbar came to Eretz Yisrael, they were all Arelim, they didn't do a bris milah in the Midbar. And it says they came out of the Yarden on the 10th day of Nisan. They definitely didn't do a bris milah on that day because of the stress of traveling. It makes them weak. It's sakara to do a bris milah. The earliest they could have possibly done a bris milah is on the 11th of Nisan. And we know that they did a Korban Pesach that year. So when did they get hazah? They must have gotten hazah earlier. If they would do hazah after the bris milah, if they would wait till after the bris milah to do hazah, they wouldn't have time to get 2 hazahs in. 2 sprinklings can't fit in from the 11th to the 15th. It has to be eaten already on the 14th. So the sprinkling had to be on the 10th. So the Gemara says, how do you know that they actually did a bris milah? That how do you know that they did a Korban Pesach at all that year? The Gemara says it's explicit. It says Vayasu es ha-pasach. The Gemara says maybe they did it betuma. Maybe they they relied on the Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor, and they didn't do sprinkling at all. There's a Bryce that says clearly Malu v'Tavlu v'Asu Pescheim b'Tahara, that they clearly did it b'Tahara. That was not the issue over there at all. All right, now the Gemara moves on to the last sugi here. The Gemara says that the mitzvah of Priya, that is the second step in a bris milah, did not apply to the original bris milahs of Avram Avinu. It only began at that time of Yeshua. Now, a bris milah is removing the flesh, the skin, and the membrane which covers the head of the aver. There are two layers. There's the skin, which is like a regular thick skin, and underneath that, once that's cut off, there's a membrane that has to be peeled back, split, and pushed down so that it doesn't cover it anymore. That's called priya. That's ma'akev. Without priya being done, the milah is pasul. The Gemara says that only began from the times of Yeshua. Avram Avinu was not given the mitzvah of priya. How do you know that? So the Gemara says because you have a pasuk that says about this incident with Yeshua when he did milah. It says Ba'isa Yomar Hashem Yeshua Aseh L'cha Charavois Tzurim, make knives, V'shuv Melos B'nei Yisrael Shenis. Go give everybody a second bris milah. Go back, go again, and give a bris milah a second time. He uses the word shuv and the word shenis. So you see that they had to do bris milah again. How could he do a second bris milah? Must be that's to remove the priya, to remove the membrane, to do priya, to remove the membrane that was still there because they didn't have that mitzvah before. Says Gemara, how do you know that it was on those who had a bris from before? Maybe it's on those who didn't have a bris. We know a large percentage of Klal Yisrael didn't do a bris. Those who were born in the midbar did not do a bris, as the Gemara will explain shortly. So no, because it says shuv, it says again. That shows that they went back and they did. There's something that was not done in an original milah that was done again. Says the Gemara, if your understanding shuv means again, so then shenis means second time as well. What's the function of that word? What's the shuv and the shenis? Gemara says that's to connect the two parts of the milah. It's the connect the beginning of the milah and the end of the milah. They're both ma'akev. What's the beginning of the milah? The end of the milah. So the beginning of the milah is the regular procedure. The end of the milah is checking that you cut off everything that needs to be cut, and there are no strips of skin that are ma'akev, that are interfering. What's a strip of skin that's interfering? So there's the ridge and the edge of the aver, the makom hamilah. That ridge has to be at least rove revealed. It cannot be covered rove of it. The majority of it cannot be covered. Not rove of its length, not rove of the breadth of the ridge, and not rove of the height of the ridge, even in one spot. Now, the Gemara discusses why was there no milah done in the midbar? Why did they wait until they arrived in Eretz Yisrael to do the milah? So the Gemara says one reason is because of the weakness of travel. They could have either just stopped traveling or never know when they had to start traveling, and therefore they could never do a bris milah, or because the winds were too strong. There was either a strong east wind, west wind. They didn't have the nice, calm north wind that they needed. Why not? Why didn't they have the nice, calm wind? Someone says either because Hashem was upset with them because of the egel, so it was a form of scolding them, or because the north wind would have scattered the clouds. The anane hakavod, in order to prevent that from happening, they didn't have the wind that they needed. Says the Gemara, Rav Papa says that on a cloudy day or a day where you don't have the right wind, that is a day that you have a south wind instead of the north wind, you should not do bloodletting and not do a bris milah because it's a sakana. As you see, Klal Yisrael didn't do it. Then says the Gemara, although today everybody seems to do it, and therefore it's considered to be something which many people do, we apply the rule of Shomer Pesayim Hashem. Hashem guards people who do foolish things.